Hey everyone, tonight we're going somewhere a little stranger. A place where the floors are always just a little too clean, the lights flicker for no reason, and the only thing more mysterious than the warning signs is the silence that follows them. Welcome to a night shift at an Iranian nuclear facility. And not just any night shift. This is Friday the 13th June 2025. Forget candlelit meals and polite conversation. A Roman banquet was a full-contact social sport. Equal parts dinner party, political trap, and endurance test for your dignity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let your mind wander, and allow the gentle rhythm of my voice to lull you towards sleep. Maybe settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There are awkward first meetings, and then there's Cajamarca. When the Spanish met the Inca in 1532, it wasn't a handshake and polite diplomacy. It was a fever dream of horses, gold, gunpowder, and theological arguments conducted at sword point. It was like watching two different dimensions collide, one running on conquest, the other on ritual, both convinced they were the centre of the universe. Let's set the scene. You're Atahualpa, emperor of the largest empire in the Americas. You command tens of thousands of warriors, control thousands of miles of road, and rule from snow-capped mountains to steaming jungle. You've just won a civil war. You're at your peak. Then a group of 168 bearded men on weird animals show up. They don't look impressive. They smell like ocean and leather. But they walk with the confidence of people who think the world belongs to them. These are the Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, part adventurer, part bureaucrat, and entirely outnumbered. He's got a priest, some interpreters, and steel, so much steel. The Inca aren't worried. Why would they be? They've seen strange people before. Some wear feathers, some paint their faces blue. None of them have ever mattered. Atahualpa agrees to meet these newcomers. He's polite, he's regal, he's absolutely not concerned. He rides into Cajamarca with his litter held high by attendants, flanked by musicians and dancers. It's a display, a message. You're in my world now. But the Spanish see something else, a moment, a gap, an opportunity. They've read the playbook of Cortés in Mexico. They know that the New World has a weakness. Empires built on systems, not suspicion. And they plan to break it open, violently. When the meeting begins, a priest steps forward. He speaks of God, of Spain, of the Pope. Then hands Atahualpa a Bible. Atahualpa flips through it. No pictures, no coca leaves tucked inside. No divine voice speaks. He tosses it aside. That's it. That's the moment. Pizarro gives the signal. Spanish guns roar. Horses charge. Steel crashes into flesh. The Inca attendants have never seen a horse. Never heard a gun. Never fought armour. They panic. They fall. They die. Atahualpa is captured in minutes. The emperor of an empire seized by a handful of strangers. And yet, this isn't the end. It's the beginning, because the Spanish didn't come for blood. They came for gold. And Atahualpa? He had an idea. Atahualpa wasn't stupid. He understood power. He just crushed his own brother in a bloody civil war. He knew how to command. But this was a new kind of war, one he didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Still, emperors improvise. From his captivity in Cajamarca, Atahualpa made the most audacious offer in the history of ransom. I will fill this room with gold, and this one with silver, floor to ceiling. Just let me go. The Spanish couldn't believe it. They measured the room. Twice. It was roughly 22 feet long, 17 wide, and over 8 feet high. That's over 6,000 kilograms of gold and 13,000 kilograms of silver. Enough to make even the most pious conquistador forget his vows. And Atahualpa kept his word. Messengers were sent across the empire. Temples were stripped, shrines emptied, gold statues melted down into bars, art turned to bullion, sacred offerings reduced to acceptable shipping size, all for the promise of freedom. The Spanish sat in Cajamarca and waited. Each day, more treasure arrived, llamas loaded with plates and goblets, bundles of silver trinkets, necklaces, masks, headdresses. It looked less like tribute and more like liquidation. Some Spaniards began to wonder, why let him go? But Pizarro was cautious. He knew a deal was a deal, even if only temporarily. He also knew the real prize wasn't just the treasure, it was the empire. And Atahualpa, for all his charm and promises, was still very much the emperor. He issued orders from his cell, sent edicts, appointed governors. He bathed, he dined. He played a ceremonial game of still in charge. It worked until it didn't. Because power doesn't just sit quietly while gold stacks up. Rival factions in the empire began to whisper. Priests frowned. Some generals muttered about divine will. And the Spanish? They started to feel like kings, not guests, not prisoners, rulers. Rumours spread that Atahualpa was plotting, that he was calling for an army, that he'd delay long enough to escape. Whether true or not didn't matter. The mood shifted. The Spaniards stopped seeing Atahualpa as a golden goose and started seeing him as a threat. Then came the trial. Yes, they gave him one. Of sorts. He was charged with treason. Against whom? Unclear. Idolatry. Polygamy. Plotting against Spain, a country he had never heard of until recently. It was theatre. And Atahualpa, for all his status, was the only one without a role to play. He was sentenced to death, but offered a choice. Burned alive, the usual penalty. Or strangled, if he converted to Christianity. He chose strangulation, was baptized Francisco, and died under the name of the man who conquered him. The room of gold had been filled and emptied, but the real treasure, the empire, remained intact, for now. The execution of Atahualpa was supposed to bring closure. It did the opposite. The Spanish expected panic, collapse. What they got was bureaucracy. Inca administrators kept working. Local officials sent reports. Messengers ran the roads. People still paid taxes, cleaned canals, obeyed rituals. It was as if the empire didn't notice its emperor had been strangled in a courtyard. But that was the genius and the vulnerability of the Inca system. It wasn't built on charisma, it was built on order. Roads, storage depots, censuses, labour quotas, redistribution, ceremonial calendars. It ran like a machine, and like any machine it kept going until something jammed. Pizarro needed a replacement emperor, someone the people would follow, but who wouldn't threaten his power, so he propped up a younger brother of Atahualpa, Tupac Hualpa. Problem solved? Not quite. Tupac Hualpa died mysteriously within months. Some say poison, others say infection. Either way, the Spanish now needed a plan C. That came in the form of Manco Inca, a royal with lineage, charm, and just enough desperation to make him pliable. At first, it worked. Manco played along. He wore the headdress, issued decrees. He was the perfect puppet, until he wasn't. Because Manco, like many before him, thought he could outsmart the invaders, thought he could gather strength behind the scenes, thought he could restore the empire from within the cage. In 1536, Manco made his move. He escaped from Spanish oversight and raised an army tens of thousands strong. He launched a siege of Cusco, the ancient Inca capital now held by Spanish troops. For 10 months, the city was a battlefield. Streets turned to trenches, temples to fortresses. The Inca fought with slings, clubs, spears, and overwhelming numbers. The Spanish responded with horses, steel, and gunpowder. Neither side gave in. It was one of the most brutal urban conflicts in the conquest of the Americas, and one that nearly worked. Manco came close, so close. He had the numbers, the high ground, the momentum, but he lacked one thing: time. Reinforcements arrived from Spain. The siege broke. Manco retreated. Not in defeat, in defiance. He fled to the jungles of Vilcabamba, a remote region the Spanish called impenetrable. There, he built a new Inca state, a rebel kingdom, a sanctuary, a ghost of empire, and for nearly 40 years it survived. Manco's resistance became a symbol, a memory, a thorn in the side of colonial rule. The empire may have lost its cities, but not its will. The fall of the Inca Empire wasn't a moment. It was a process, slow, splintered, and tragically bureaucratic. After Manco Inca's retreat to Vilcabamba, Spain had to deal with two worlds at once. The official world, full of titles, maps, and paperwork, where the empire was conquered, and the real world, messy, mountainous, jungle-choked, where rebels still held ground. On paper, Spain ruled. On the ground, it bled. The jungle wasn't just humid, it fought back. Spanish soldiers died of snake bites, fevers, infected wounds. Their armour rusted. Their horses broke legs on muddy slopes. Their letters home described a world of ghosts and ambushes. Vilcabamba became a symbol, a stubborn holdout, a scar on the neat narrative of conquest. Every few years, a new Spanish commander would try to finish the job. They'd send envoys, then troops, then more envoys. They'd offer treaties, threats, and sugar-coated sermons. The Incas, or what was left of them, always had the same answer: we're still here. And they were. In secret valleys they rebuilt temples, held ceremonies, raised children who'd never seen a Spanish helmet up close. For decades this back and forth continued. Then, in 1571, came the final chapter. A young Inca ruler named Tupac Amaru, the last of his line, sat on the throne of Vilcabamba. He didn't want war, but Spain did. A new viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, decided enough was enough. He launched a full invasion. Spanish forces marched through terrain they barely understood. They burned farms, killed llamas, poisoned wells, and eventually they captured Tupac Amaru. They marched him to Cusco, once the capital of his ancestors, and executed him in the town square. Eyewitnesses said the crowd wept. Even some Spaniards looked away. Because this wasn't a victory, it was an ending. With Tupac Amaru's death, the Inca resistance was officially over. No more emperors, no more Vilcabamba. Just legends, ruins, and a growing silence. But empires don't die cleanly. They echo, in language, in roads still walked, in names whispered during festivals, in statues buried and dug up again, in stubborn grandmothers who insist potatoes should be grown that way, because that's how their ancestors did it. The Spanish never fully understood what they had destroyed, and the Inca, for all their tragedy, never truly vanished. You can still hear them in the Andes, in wind that remembers, in mountains that keep secrets, and in voices that say, "We're still here." The story of the Spanish and the Inca did not end with Tupac Amaru. It simply moved underground, into memory, legend, and silence. What the Spanish believed they had conquered was the shell of an empire. What they didn't realize was that the soul of Tawantinsuyu, the Inca realm, was a network of breath, mountain, and memory. It didn't need palaces or emperors to survive. It just needed time. Let's look at what didn't die. The roads still ran. Tens of thousands of kilometres of stone-paved pathways, expertly engineered across cliffs, rivers and mountains. Spanish horses trod those same paths, unaware they were walking on centuries of imperial planning. The quipus, knotted cords that once recorded taxes, births, deaths and sacred events, weren't entirely lost. Spanish officials burned many, thinking they contained pagan secrets. But some communities hid theirs, passing them down silently, waiting for a time when memory was safer. The language, Quechua, was too wide to erase. The Spanish clergy tried to teach Latin, then Spanish, then imposed new laws and catechisms. But in Andean villages, Quechua was spoken in whispers, in lullabies, in prayers not meant for the ears of friars. And then there were the names. Beneath Catholic saints, many locals still honoured old gods. Pachamama, the Earth Mother, never left. She just began wearing a Virgin Mary's robe. Inti, the sun, wasn't prayed to directly, but every festival started at sunrise, facing east. Resistance became coded, a bowl of maize left beside a stone, a festival conveniently close to solstice, a child named after a mountain, even if baptized under a Spanish name. But while culture endured, politics fractured. Spanish administrators didn't want a united Andes. They wanted control, and control meant division. They split villages, moved populations, banned travel without papers. They introduced repartimiento, a forced labour system that demanded work in mines, fields or workshops. This wasn't just economic extraction, it was cultural dismemberment. Families were split. Children were orphaned by mercury fumes in silver mines. Villages, once proud of their mita contributions, collective labour for the good of the empire, were now reduced to silence under whip and crucifix. And yet, they kept planting potatoes. They sang while threshing grain. They wove textiles with symbols older than Christ. In the highlands, where Spanish power thinned like oxygen, whole valleys remained de facto independent. Local Caracas, indigenous leaders, walked a tightrope between appeasing Spanish governors and protecting their people. Some collaborated, some resisted. Most did both, often on the same day. By the 17th century, a new generation was born, children who had never seen the Inca state but still dreamed of it. This is where the ghost of empire became something more powerful than empire itself. Myth. And myth has legs. Stories spread of golden cities hidden in the jungle, of an immortal Inca king who would return, of signs in the stars, dreams from ancestors, messages in coca leaves. Spanish officials laughed until rebellions broke out. In 1780, over 2 centuries after Atahualpa's execution, a man named José Gabriel Condorcanqui took the name Tupac Amaru II, claiming descent from the final Inca. He wore native dress, rode horses like a Spanish noble, read Enlightenment philosophy, and then declared war. He led the largest indigenous uprising in colonial South America, rallying thousands to his cause. For a brief moment the Andes burned again. His rebellion failed. He was executed, drawn and quartered in Cusco, the same city where the Spanish had executed the original Tupac Amaru. But his final words still echo, "Volveré y seré millones." I shall return, and I shall be millions. He was right. The Inca didn't return as emperors. They returned as peasants demanding land, as poets speaking Quechua on state radio, as activists replanting native crops, defending glaciers, or marching under the banner of Pachamama. They returned in ruins that refused to crumble, in trails that still hold footsteps, in DNA, in grief, in pride. Today, when you stand in Cusco or Machu Picchu, you might feel like you're looking at history, but the people living nearby don't see ruins. They see continuity. The empire may have fallen, but its heart is still beating. The myth of the Inca never needed to be accurate. It needed to be useful. For some, it was a story of justice, a lost age when food was shared, land was sacred, and rulers fasted with their people. For others, it was a weapon, a rallying cry for rebellion against greedy governors and forgotten promises. For Spain, it was a problem that refused to die. Officials in Lima debated whether to ban all talk of the Inca past. They outlawed symbols, banned music, punished teachers. But the memory didn't fade. It adapted. Priests complained that villagers still sang in their native tongue when drunk, that they painted their saints with sunbursts and wore llama wool beneath their silk, that they lit candles to the Virgin, but at the top of mountains. The Spanish wanted conversion, but they got fusion. Today, if you travel through Peru or Bolivia or Ecuador, you'll see this fusion in every corner. A roadside shrine to Mary framed by coca leaves. A cross atop a hill once sacred to Illapa, the god of thunder. Festivals that blend Catholic saints with solstices, war dances, and offerings of maize beer. Colonialism imposed its gods, but it couldn't erase roots. In fact, some of the most powerful resistance movements in Latin American history have drawn directly from the Inca legacy, not from its facts, but from its symbolic truth. The Zapatistas of southern Mexico invoked Inca-style community justice. Quechua-speaking activists in Bolivia wear Andean symbols at climate marches. Even in global pop culture, you'll find the Inca echo as mystical, tragic, wise, and ever adaptable. But for the descendants of the empire, it's more than symbolism, it's identity. For many indigenous families, the story of the conquest is not ancient, it's personal. It's grandfather's field, it's grandmother's weaving, it's the Spanish last name they carry, and the Quechua one they whisper. Every time a child learns their ancestral language again, every time a ruin is preserved instead of bulldozed, every time potatoes are planted in terraced fields like they were 600 years ago, the Inca breathe again. And it's not nostalgia. It's strategy. Because in a world of disappearing cultures, melting glaciers, and threatened forests, the knowledge of the Andes, how to farm with the rain, how to pray with the land, how to build with the slope, not against it, is no longer traditional, it's revolutionary. The Spanish conquest reshaped the map, but it didn't win the story, because the story kept growing, in quiet places, in song, in rebellion, in love, and now it lives not in gold, not in blood, not in conquest, but in the stubborn heartbeat of a people who never truly surrendered. The Andes are not quiet, they hum, they breathe. To the outside eye it might look like stillness, terraced hills, misted valleys, an old woman weaving by a fire, but beneath it is motion, intention, memory. What the Spanish never understood is that the Inca didn't believe in time the same way. History wasn't behind them, it walked beside them. So the fall of the empire was not an ending, just a transformation. The terraces still cling to the sides of cliffs, producing more food per square metre than many modern farms. The irrigation canals carved hundreds of years ago still carry water with perfect gradient, no modern engineer required. And the concept of Aialu, a community structure based on mutual aid, remains alive in practice, even when its name is forgotten. In the modern world, Inca legacy survives in unexpected ways. A tourist in Peru may drink coca tea in a ceramic cup and take selfies in front of a ruined fortress. But a local guide might quietly explain that the stones aren't ruins, they're ancestors. That the tea isn't for fun, it's for altitude and for ritual. That what looks like brokenness is actually continuity, dressed in new clothes. And then there are the voices. Scholars now suspect that many quipas were not just accounting tools, but narratives. Stories encoded in fibre, colour and knot spacing. We may never read them fluently, but they hint that history was told in more than words. It was woven. In recent decades, indigenous scholars, linguists and activists have begun reclaiming this voice, rewriting textbooks, teaching children that pre-Columbian does not mean pre-civilized, that Inca architecture was earthquake-resistant before the term existed, that empire doesn't always mean tyranny. That loss isn't the same as disappearance. From Cusco to Otavalo to La Paz, new generations walk with both worlds on their shoulders, colonial legacy in their ID cards, Inca pride in their bones, and they are doing what their ancestors did best, adapting. They use smartphones to document sacred sites, post oral histories on social media, organise farming cooperatives that echo the Mitya, run ecotourism collectives named after Pachacutec, grow potatoes under the stars beside solar panels. The empire, in some way, has returned, not as conquest, not as kingdom, but as worldview, as resilience. So when you stand on a high pass in the Andes and hear wind moving through stones, that's not just weather. That's Tawantinsuyu still speaking. You may not understand the language, but if you listen, really listen, you'll hear what the Spanish never could. We're not gone. We were just waiting. Imagine arriving in Egypt as a Roman soldier. You've crossed seas, deserts, and half the known world, only to find yourself face to face with your worst enemy, lunch. You expected glory, adventure, maybe a few easy months guarding a granary. What you got was a plate of pickled fish guts, sour beer, and something green you're pretty sure is still moving. Let's set the scene. You're stationed in Alexandria, 1st century CE. The climate, hot enough to boil your sandals. The local dialect, incomprehensible. The streets, packed with scribes, priests, grain merchants, and the occasional monkey wearing eyeliner. But worst of all, the food. Roman soldiers were used to a certain routine. They brought their culture with them wherever they marched, and that included their stomachs. In a Roman camp, meals were structured, simple, and built around wheat, oil, wine, and dried pork. Standard, bland, efficient. Nobody wrote love poems to a soldier's diet, but it kept you moving and didn't kill you. Then Egypt happened. Let's start with bread. Romans loved their wheat, fine, white, milled down to near purity. In Egypt, the bread was coarse, gritty, and often made from emmer, an ancient grain so chewy, biting into it felt like challenging a pharaoh to single combat. Worse, it was often baked in sand ovens, which meant you weren't just eating bread, you were also eating the Nile. Then there was the beer. Roman soldiers were wine men. Wine was civilized, refined. It was something you watered down and shared at banquets, not something you drank for calories. Egyptian beer, on the other hand, was thick, sour and cloudy. It was made from fermented bread, served at room temperature and often still had floating bits of grain in it. One soldier wrote home describing it as bread soup that had committed treason. And then, the fish. Oh, the fish. Egyptians loved their fish fermented, dried, salted, and preferably stuffed inside other fish. There were sauces made of crushed fish guts, pickled fish brine, and for special occasions fish heads soaked in vinegar and honey. Romans, accustomed to the milder taste of garum, their own fish sauce, were shocked. One legionnaire reportedly fainted after mistaking a festival platter for a battlefield casualty. Then there were the things that looked like food but weren't. Take lotus root. Looks harmless. Slice it, fry it, and suddenly your intestines are reenacting the siege of Carthage. Or fenugreek paste. A bitter, sticky mess that Egyptians swore by as a digestive tonic, and Roman soldiers swore at when they realised it didn't come with bread or dignity. There were also dates stuffed with goat cheese, preserved lemons dipped in ash, and something called doom fruit, a hard, fibrous thing that required more chewing than a diplomatic treaty. And let's not forget the eggs. Egyptians had a habit of burying eggs in warm sand for weeks, letting them ripen before serving. The result was a sulphurous, runny mess that made Roman mess halls smell like a punishment from the gods. But it wasn't just taste, it was symbolism. Romans associated certain foods with power, virtue, and identity. Bread was more than sustenance. It was a Roman rite. Wine was more than a drink. It was Roman civilization in a cup. To give that up and accept fermented crocodile tail as dinner felt like cultural betrayal. Officers tried to adapt. Some brought their own supplies. Others struck deals with local merchants to import Italian staples, olive oil, flour, salted meat. But the farther you were from Rome, the more impossible that became. Supply chains broke down. Local corruption skimmed off rations. And before long, even the officers were eyeing those goat cheese-stuffed dates with wary hunger. Of course, there were those who embraced it. Some younger recruits saw Egyptian food as exotic, exciting. They traded recipes. They grew fond of hibiscus tea, flatbreads cooked on open stones and roasted pigeon with honey. But for the average soldier, tired, homesick and sunburned, mealtime was a daily act of survival. One papyrus letter from a centurion to his brother in Rome reads, "If mother sends another shipment, tell her, no more sausages, no more figs, just send salt. We're dying without it. The beer here is an offence to Jupiter. I dream of olives and wait to fish heads." Some veterans returned home and never touched fish again. Others developed lifelong digestive issues. One famously wrote a travelogue titled "Through the Belly of Egypt," which was banned for harming morale, and yet food was the least of their worries, because soon Roman soldiers in Egypt would face something worse than lotus stew: politics. But that's for the next part. But here's the secret no legionary dared to say out loud. Some of the food wasn't just weird, it was frightening. Egyptians worshipped animals, not in a poetic, symbolic sense, literally. Cats were sacred, crocodiles had temples, bulls were embalmed. So when a Roman was handed a bowl of stew with local delicacies, he didn't just ask what's in it. He asked, "Am I about to anger a god?" Take crocodile meat. Egyptians ate it in parts of the Fayum, and considered it both nutritious and powerful, but to Roman eyes it was the equivalent of chewing on a demon. Its oily texture and gamey flavour didn't help. One Roman officer reportedly buried an entire cauldron of it, rather than risk spiritual contamination. Then there was the fear of accidentally ingesting something ritual. Egyptians used food in funerary rites, honey-soaked cakes for the dead, wine mixed with myrrh for embalming. To a soldier unfamiliar with the local customs, everything looked like a potential offering. Was that lentil stew a snack or a sacrifice? Superstition thrived. Rumours spread in barracks that eating certain herbs could curse your next son. Others claimed that fennel root made you sterile. One tale involved a soldier who ate a black egg during an eclipse and was dead within a week. The medical officers rolled their eyes, but men refused their rations all the same. And let's not forget the water. In Rome, water was aqueduct clear, flowing from engineered marvels built by slaves and genius. In Egypt, water came from the Nile. Sacred, yes, but also home to silt, parasites, and more than a few floating surprises. Soldiers boiled it, strained it, prayed over it. Some chose beer, disgusting, sour beer, over risking a mouthful of crocodile backwash. Then there was the psychological toll. Back home, food reinforced identity. You ate bread and olive oil because you were Roman. You drank wine because you were civilized. Every meal reinforced that you belonged to a mighty empire. But in Egypt, you were the outsider. You ate like an outsider. You smelled like an outsider. Your breath stank of foreign spices. Your clothes absorbed the scent of fermented lentils. You couldn't even burp without someone asking, "Are you ill or just eating local again?" It wore you down. Even letters home became bitter. Soldiers who once asked for socks and coins now begged for garlic, bay leaves, or just vinegar. Anything that reminded them they were Roman. One grizzled centurion even tried to cook his own bread over an open flame. He built a makeshift oven from broken amphorae. The result? A hard, blistered lump of dough that cracked a fellow soldier's tooth and was used as a doorstop for 3 months. Officers tried morale dinners, Roman night, with imported olives and cheese, but the supplies ran out quickly. By the 3rd week it was just dried chickpeas, a speech about Mars and tears. Worse still were the festivals. Egyptian festivals were loud, colourful, and full of ceremonial foods. Sweet things, spicy things, sticky things. Foods offered to gods then served to the public. Soldiers didn't know whether to eat, kneel, or run. One commander accidentally insulted an entire district by refusing to drink from a communal beer jar. He claimed dysentery. The locals claimed blasphemy. The misunderstanding nearly started a riot. Yet amidst all this confusion, some soldiers slowly adjusted. They started chewing fennel to soothe the gut. They learned to peel doom fruit properly. They discovered that if you mix sour beer with enough honey, it starts to taste like less shame. A few even married local women and learned to cook with tamarind and coriander. These men were called stomach traitors by the rest. But they smiled more, slept better, and rarely complained about rations. Because in the end, what you eat becomes what you are. And for some Romans, Egypt didn't just fill their bellies, it cracked open their world view. But for others, it was still just suffering in a bowl. And as Egypt's politics got messier, revolts, grain shortages, riots, even those who had learned to live with lotus paste and fish brine sauce started to wonder, was any of this worth it? If you were a Roman stationed in Egypt, food wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a political tightrope. To survive as a foreign soldier in a land older than your gods, you had to balance diplomacy with digestion. Every bite risked offence. Every flavour masked a potential insult. Why? Because Egyptians didn't just eat, they worshipped through food. Meals were offerings, ingredients were symbols, Even how you sat, served, or chewed could carry religious meaning. Take onions. Romans liked them roasted or raw, used sparingly, mostly as medicine or seasoning. But in Egypt, onions were holy, associated with rebirth, eternity, and placed inside tombs to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Some priests refused to eat them altogether, while others used them in rituals. So imagine the horror when a Roman cook chopped up a bushel of onions to flavour sausage stew, and then served it to a group of local scribes. The backlash lasted a week, and included a protest where someone painted an angry mural of a Roman officer vomiting on a shrine. Garlic, too, posed problems. Romans loved garlic. Soldiers practically stank of it. But Egyptians considered it medicinal, not culinary, more for poultices than pasta. Locals would wrinkle their noses at the breath of Roman patrols. One Alexandrian merchant complained that talking to a Roman centurion was like bargaining inside a plague house. Even how you cooked caused tension. Romans preferred slow roasts, dry curing and boiling. Egyptians loved steaming, fermenting and frying in fat. Spices were heavily used, not just for taste, but to align the body with celestial rhythms. Cinnamon wasn't just spice, it was solar. Coriander was lunar. Cardamom was the breath of the eastern wind. A soldier tossing all three into a stew might unintentionally declare war on someone's grandmother. Then came the bread wars. Roman soldiers, used to uniform loaves and precise rations, were baffled by Egypt's wild variety of bread. Some were soft and airy, others flat and hard. Some were sweetened with dates, others stuffed with beans. There were breads shaped like birds, like gods, like private parts. A bakery near Memphis was shut down after Roman officials claimed its breads encouraged disorderly thoughts among legionaries. The locals responded by doubling production. It wasn't just what you ate, it was when. The Roman military followed a strict schedule. Breakfast before sunrise, midday meal at rest, dinner at dusk. In Egypt, meal times were often dictated by the sun's position, religious calendars, or lunar phases. Soldiers who ate during a holy hour could offend an entire village. One unit was nearly stoned after roasting lamb during a fasting festival. The commander claimed ignorance. The priest claimed sacrilege. The lamb tragically went uneaten. Worse still, Egypt had food taboos by region. What was sacred in Thebes was lunch in Memphis. What was forbidden in Hermopolis was traded openly in Oxyrhynchus. A Roman soldier might enjoy grilled ibis one day and discover the next that he had desecrated the spirit of Thoth. This inconsistency drove officers mad. Some tried issuing region-specific dietary guides, but the papyrus copies were slow to arrive and often full of errors. One edition translated safe fish as sacred ancestors. A patrol in the Delta accidentally organised a feast in honour of someone's great-grandmother. And then there was the grain problem. Rome depended on Egyptian grain. Tons of it. Daily. The entire capital ran on Egyptian wheat. It was the lifeline of the empire, which meant Roman soldiers in Egypt had a dual role: enforce order and protect the harvest. But locals didn't always appreciate Roman help. Farmers accused the army of hoarding grain, underpaying for barley, or trampling fields during drills. Protests erupted. Some villagers refused to feed station troops unless paid in full, in silver. No scrip, no promises. Worse, when harvests failed, as they sometimes did, blame fell on the foreigners. A drought. Roman arrogance angered the Nile. Locusts. A Roman patrol disrespected a statue of Happy. Floods. A legionary peed on sacred reeds. The soldiers couldn't win. They couldn't eat in peace. They couldn't walk through markets without being eyed suspiciously. Even buying food became a negotiation. Prices were fluid, based on status, accent, and facial hair. A clean-shaven Roman might pay twice as much as a local with a beard. Some soldiers tried blending in by growing moustaches, learning phrases in Coptic, or adopting local jewellery. One cohort famously swapped their helmets for linen wraps. It worked until sunstroke took out half the unit. In barracks, food became political currency. If you had access to olive oil, you were royalty. A dried fig, worth 2 favours, dried Italian sausage. You could get promoted. Officers used their rations to win loyalty. Quartermasters were bribed. Black markets thrived. There were rumours of a mule being traded for a wheel of Roman cheese, and slowly, quietly, some soldiers broke. They stopped writing home. They stopped attending temple. They started eating like locals, dressing like locals, thinking like locals. The brass called it cultural drift. The men called it giving up. Because when every bite is a battle, and every meal a reminder that you don't belong, eventually you stop fighting your hunger. You just eat, even if it tastes like roasted blasphemy. Sometimes cultural adaptation wasn't about survival. It was about strategy. A few clever officers realised that to rule Egypt, you didn't just need spears, you needed spoons. They began recruiting local cooks, not slaves, professionals. Men and women who knew which herbs calm the stomach and which dishes wouldn't provoke a riot. One such officer, a tribune named Gaius Petronius Lupus, became famous for his kitchen reforms. He instituted dual menus, Roman-style dishes for the homesick, Egyptian options for the curious. Soldiers had to mark their preferences in advance. His legion had the lowest rates of illness, unrest, and insubordination in the province. His secret? He listened. He learned which dishes were sacred, which spices were seasonal, and, most importantly, which food customs were linked to power. Because food wasn't just nutrition, it was a hierarchy. In Roman mess halls, rank dictated portions. In Egyptian temples, status determined who prepared the food. Mixing those systems led to chaos. One centurion got demoted after slapping a temple cook for burning the lentils, only to discover that the cook was also a priest, with cousins in politics. The lesson? Food diplomacy mattered. Yet not every unit had a lupus. Most soldiers still struggled with the daily balancing act of what to eat, where to eat, and with whom. Field campaigns were the worst. Rations were shipped in barrels, often spoiled, infested, or mislabeled. Grain meant for humans fed horses. Cheese turned to sludge in the heat. Salted meat arrived already buzzing with flies. To compensate, foraging became standard. But Egyptian wild food was unfamiliar. Some plants were medicinal, others were lethal. One unit boiled acacia pods for stew and ended up hallucinating for 2 days. Another roasted a nest of scarab beetles, mistaking it for truffle fungi. The taste was described as nutty, with notes of irreversible regret. Then came the diseases. New food meant new bacteria. Roman guts, bred on pasta and olives, weren't ready for Nile microbes. Dysentery ran through camps like wildfire. So did parasites. Even attempts to purify water, with wine, salt or silver coins, often failed. Field latrines overflowed. Doctors wrote desperate scrolls. One grim report noted, "Today, 32 men fell, not to battle, but to beans." As if that weren't enough, morale suffered. A man could endure hunger, he could endure thirst, but having his dignity mocked by a pickled radish? That broke him. Food became metaphor. Soldiers who couldn't stomach Egyptian dishes were seen as weak. Those who adapted too quickly were labelled traitors. Cohesion fractured. Cooks became scapegoats. So did quartermasters. One particularly infamous food riot began when a cook announced a surprise pudding, which turned out to be mashed fava beans moulded into the shape of Caesar's face. The result? 3 broken noses, 2 demotions, and a general order banning all culinary representations of the emperor. But perhaps the strangest result of all came from a contest. One governor, in a bid to ease tensions, hosted a cooking competition. Romans versus Egyptians. The prize, 3 amphorae of wine, a month's worth of grain, and glory. The Egyptian side presented a spiced lentil dish topped with grilled tilapia and sweet onion jam. The Roman side offered barley porridge with aged pork and vinegar. The judges, a panel of local elders and Roman officers, were split. But then came the final plate, a fusion dish created by a Roman centurion who had married a local woman. It was chicken stewed with coriander, honey, wine and garlic, served with both Roman flatbread and Egyptian lotus chips. It won, unanimously. The men cheered, the elders wept. The governor asked for seconds. That day, for just a moment, food did what no legion had managed. It united Egypt and Rome, not in conquest, but in curiosity. Of course, the next day someone poisoned a lentil cart and everything went back to chaos. But for a few glorious hours, a Roman soldier didn't hate Egyptian food. He loved it. When a Roman legionary complained about Egyptian food, it wasn't always about the taste. Sometimes it was about being watched while eating, by statues, by cats, and sometimes by people who hadn't blinked in 5 minutes. You see, in Egypt, meals had eyes. Not metaphorically, literally. Painted eyes on pottery, sacred beetle-shaped plates, even fish served whole, head-on, staring into your soul while you tried to chew. One unlucky legionary reportedly shouted, "I'm not being judged by a carp," before flipping his plate and causing a diplomatic incident at a merchant's home. But this wasn't just superstition, it was cosmic etiquette. Egyptian belief held that the act of eating wasn't just consumption, it was alignment with the gods, with the seasons, with your own body's inner clock, which apparently shouldn't digest lentils during the hour of Orion. Roman soldiers, used to shoving food down between drills, suddenly had to time their bites. Some started carrying wax tablets with acceptable eating hours carved in. One poor Optio tried to eat during a partial eclipse and was tackled by temple guards. He choked on a fig, survived, was fined 2 goats. It got weirder. One legion was stationed near a temple of Hathor where music was forbidden during meals, unless it was flute music, and only if played in E minor, and only if the performer wore linen gloves. This was somehow considered normal, but not for Marcus Publius Victor, who just wanted to eat his lentil soup in silence. He violated this rule accidentally, humming while chewing, and was promptly cursed by the temple's cook priest. For 3 days his voice echoed 0.3 seconds out of sync, a fate worse than a hangover. Back at base, commanders tried to impose order. They commissioned digestive manuals for the Nile provinces, 10 scrolls outlining safe food, forbidden snacks, and recommended chewing speeds. They distributed guides titled, "So You've Been Assigned to Memphis," and 10 local dishes that won't get you cursed. It didn't help, because Egyptian cuisine wasn't just about ingredients. It was about stories. Each dish came with history, a meaning, a warning. One delicacy, keratem sechem, was a fermented bean spread supposedly invented by a priest who misheard a divine recipe. Eating it was said to grant visions, or severe gas. Roman soldiers risked both. It became a rite of passage. If you could eat 2 spoonfuls without hallucinating or swearing in Latin, you were ready for Egypt. Then came the festivals. During the Festival of the Valley, guests were expected to consume symbolic foods from miniature model tombs, tiny loaves, doll-sized poultry, dried pomegranates served inside clay sarcophagi. Refusing them was considered a rejection of the afterlife. The legate of the 12th Legion once tried to politely decline a symbolic fig. He woke up the next morning with 7 cats on his tent and a note reading, "Your spirit has offended the ancestors. Rectify by dusk or suffer feline justice." He rectified. Meanwhile, cooks had their own revenge. They grew tired of Roman complaints, the constant sneering, the refusal to eat anything not doused in garum, so they got creative. One cook began serving dishes with names that sounded Latin but were nonsense. Pulmentum ignis caeli, which turned out to be boiled desert snails and goat's milk. Another disguised pickled lotus stems as Roman asparagus. Reviews were mixed. One soldier called it a revelation. Another bit into the stem, yelled treason, and stabbed the table. Eventually, Rome adapted the only way it knew how, by regulating everything. A new culinary rank was created, the Praefectus Panis, the bread overseer. His job was to coordinate cross-cultural menus, ensure religious dietary compliance, and inspect imported amphorae for hidden cats. Even coinage was affected. One governor commissioned a special token called the nummus edilis to be used at food markets to indicate approved Roman buyers. Locals accepted it, for a time, until counterfeit tokens flooded the markets with crude carvings of centurions eating grapes. Trust evaporated. Still, there were moments. Strange, quiet moments. When the cultures did more than clash, they melded. A centurion named Cassius Verus married a baker's daughter from Heliopolis. Their wedding feast featured a roast goose stuffed with lentils and apples glazed in honey wine, a blend of Roman and Egyptian tastes. The dish became so popular it was eventually banned by a later prefect for undermining traditional discipline through excessive deliciousness. Cassius went on to author a scroll titled De Culinaria Concordia, on culinary harmony. It was part cookbook, part peace treaty, part marriage therapy guide. Among his recipes, stewed chickpeas with cumin and vinegar for reconciling arguments over socks, boiled figs with goat cheese, to survive awkward dinners with in-laws, honey-roasted radishes, for when diplomacy fails and flavour must prevail. His scroll became popular among younger officers, not just for the recipes, but for the sense that maybe, just maybe, Rome didn't have to conquer everything to enjoy it. Still, for every Cassius there were 5 other soldiers screaming at their bowls of lentil goo, praying for a plate of Roman boar. Because adaptation is hard, especially when your lunch is judged by a cat statue and accompanied by a curse that makes your breath smell like papyrus, and when the winds howled over the Nile and the desert stretched forever, and the bread came in shapes you didn't understand. It wasn't just your stomach that suffered, it was your identity. There was one dish Roman soldiers in Egypt feared above all else. It wasn't raw fish. It wasn't boiled papyrus root. It wasn't even pickled ibis tongues, which were more of a delicacy than a dare. No, it was a deceptively simple item known locally as bread, but not the warm, fluffy, crusty kind Roman bakers perfected. No golden loaves with a satisfying crunch. Egyptian bread, made from emmer wheat and often baked in open-air pits, was dense, dark, and full of surprises. Sometimes literal surprises. Sand, gravel, bone fragments. Not because the Egyptians were careless. Quite the opposite. The bread was holy, sacred, and the ovens were ancient, used by generations of families. Bits of past meals, old ash, and stone mill residue mixed in with the dough like history's seasoning. Roman soldiers were not amused. A centurion once cracked a molar biting into a ceremonial loaf during a religious feast. He demanded compensation. The local priest offered him a jar of date syrup and a handwritten scroll explaining the bread's spiritual density. The centurion threw the scroll into the Nile. The priest cursed his beard. He grew patchy stubble for 3 months. Bread became a battlefield. Officers began issuing rations-only orders, forbidding soldiers from accepting local food. This led to confusion when a local festival included free bread as a sign of peace. Several soldiers refused and were chased through the streets by offended grandmothers, wielding loaves like clubs. And then came the plague. Not a literal one, a metaphorical outbreak of fusion food. A culinary experimenter named Tiberius Scaever, known among the ranks as Sauce Boy, began blending Roman and Egyptian ingredients in ways nature never intended. Honey-glazed dormice served over lentil stew, flamingo sausage with pickled lotus root, garum-infused crocodile skewers. Some praised his courage, others accused him of heresy. One legionnaire wrote, "We march for Rome, but we dine in purgatory." Yet Scaever's inventions caught on. A tavern in Alexandria started serving legion wraps, flatbread filled with figs, cured goat, and crushed olives. They were a hit. Within weeks, Roman officers were sneaking out of camp to buy them, leaving behind stale army biscuits in protest. Of course, the backlash followed. Traditionalists called it culinary treason. One senator demanded that Egyptian street food be banned from Roman camps. Another proposed a purity list of foods considered acceptably Roman. His list included barley, boar, and anything boiled for at least 6 hours. It failed. Spectacularly. Because even the most hardened Roman stomachs began to soften toward the new flavours. One unit began celebrating Feast Fridays, inviting local cooks to prepare dishes. It started as a joke. Then it became morale-boosting. Then it became a reason to re-enlist. The army adapted. New roles emerged. Legatus Coccinae, a kind of food ambassador. His job was to evaluate local recipes for compatibility with Roman discipline. Dishes were judged not just for flavour, but for how likely they were to cause hallucinations, religious riots, or extended latrine duty. There were ratings. One fig-based dessert was labelled safe but sticky. A fermented onion paste earned proceed with caution. A honey-roasted beet dish received too delicious, encourages idleness. Even punishments became culinary. One soldier caught stealing amphorae was sentenced to eat the 7 sorrows of Osiris. 7 small plates of increasing weirdness, culminating in a boiled ox tongue served on a tablet of hard clay. He confessed to more crimes just to end the meal early. Despite everything, some soldiers still resisted. They hoarded dried meat, smuggled olive oil, hid Roman crackers in their boots. They clung to the familiar like a shield. But time wore them down, and then came one final test. A military banquet was organised by a new governor determined to prove that unity was possible. He called it the 12 Courses of Concord. Each course blended Roman and Egyptian traditions. Course 1, spiced chickpeas on Roman trenchers. Course 4, Nile perch cooked in wine with rosemary. Course 8, lotus fritters with goat cheese. Course 12, a cake shaped like a legionnaire's helmet filled with date custard. The reactions were mixed. Some laughed, some cried. One veteran wrote home, "I came to conquer. I leave converted. Also, mildly constipated." In that moment, something shifted. The food no longer symbolised foreignness or fear. It became familiar. The battle over meals became a story of assimilation. Not surrender, but synthesis. A graffiti found in the barracks of Legio XXIII read, "I hated the bread. I mocked the beans, but I stayed for the stew." Another, scratched into a wall near the bath, simply read, "No more garum, ever, but I would kill for lentils." And so the legacy of Roman soldiers in Egypt was not just one of conquest or administration, but of digestion. They came, they saw, they chewed, and sometimes they even liked it. If you were an emperor of ancient China and someone mentioned the word comet, you did not go, "Oh, pretty." You went pale. You summoned your astrologers. You possibly began composing your will. Because in the imperial worldview, a comet was not just a celestial event. It was a cosmic accusation. These fiery-tailed sky intruders weren't admired. They were feared, catalogued, interpreted, and, on occasion, blamed for just about every problem imaginable. A drought? Comet. Uprising in the west? Clearly a comet. Bad dumpling batch at the palace banquet. Almost certainly a comet. But unlike in Rome or Greece, where comets were ominous but vague, in China they were specific. The Shiji and Zhuojuan, ancient Chinese chronicles, contain entire sections where comets are linked to types of disasters, emotions, punishments, and even hairstyles. One record notes, "A red-tailed comet, rising in the east, signals the death of a great minister. If the tail splits, two shall perish." Another adds, "A white-tailed comet moving westward means flooding in the southern provinces. 3 harvests will fail." Naturally, emperors were deeply invested in the heavens. They had to be. They were the son of heaven, after all. If the sky looked angry, it wasn't just bad luck. It was personal. It meant you were screwing up. So when a comet appeared, it triggered a cascade of ritual responses. First came the observers, court astronomers stationed in tall towers, bundled in robes, peering through tubes, scrawling marks on bamboo slips. The moment a strange light flickered in the sky, they lit signal fires and banged drums. Then came the reports. Thick scrolls delivered to the emperor, noting the comet's direction, brightness, tail length, and what animal its shape resembled. Yes, that mattered. "A broom-star shaped like a horse galloping westward," said one entry, "shall sweep away the mandate of the ruler unless the correct offerings are made." Emperors took no chances. Whole bureaucracies sprang into action. A sighting might lead to the suspension of executions, cancellation of music performances, or emergency donations to river gods. One emperor reportedly sacrificed 100 sheep and banned garlic for a month. No one knows why, but the comet disappeared, so it was deemed effective. Some rulers issued self-criticism edicts, known as Zui Ji. These were formal apologies to heaven, admitting flaws in governance and begging for cosmic leniency. Imagine waking up and writing, "To the celestial powers, I, Emperor Huandi, humbly admit I was too harsh with the tax collectors in Hebei. Also, I regret the tiger hunt. Please do not flood the eastern provinces." But it wasn't all panic and poetry. Some emperors tried to science their way through the fear. During the Han Dynasty, a scholar named Gan Day attempted to catalogue comets systematically. He gave them names like Longbeard and Broomsweeper, noting which ones preceded earthquakes and which just seemed to make everyone moody. Later, the Tang court maintained comet archives, literal libraries of sky omen events cross-referenced with historical disasters. One clerk named Xu Feng supposedly spent his entire life charting tail angles, comet densities, and rainfall levels. He died of ink poisoning. His charts survived. Still, emperors struggled with guilt, because in Chinese political thought, disasters weren't random. They were moral. A comet wasn't just a rock in space. It was heaven's blog post saying, "You messed up, and here's a fiery punctuation mark to prove it." One emperor famously abdicated 3 days after a comet sighting, convinced heaven was asking for his resignation. His brother took over and immediately commissioned a temple dedicated to not screwing things up. Another ruler locked himself in the palace for 9 days and emerged with a scroll titled Reflections on Celestial Shame. It was 98 pages of self-blame and astronomy. He ordered it burned on day 10. Not all responses were sombre. Some emperors tried to bribe the sky. They released flocks of birds, planted symbolic gardens, and once, a particularly odd case, a ruler hosted a banquet for the stars. He dined alone at night on a tower rooftop, offering wine to the Big Dipper and reading poetry to Sirius. When the comet didn't leave, he fired his astrologers, then rehired them the next day just in case. These men, the astrologers, lived in a state of constant fear and reverence. Their predictions could save or doom a dynasty. Misinterpreting a comet might lead to exile. Or worse, being assigned to calculate rainfall for rice harvests in some mosquito-infested valley. So they became master dramatists, a slight shimmer in the eastern quadrant. A sign, perhaps, that the Minister of Agriculture is due for a haircut. A bold streak across the southern sky. Surely, an omen warning against extravagant spending on bronze statues of wild boars. To hedge their bets, they often added disclaimers like, unless the court undertakes acts of generosity, in which case the omen may soften. Emperors listened, sometimes too well. There was an emperor who, upon hearing such a report, immediately decreed a national day of penance. All officials wore mourning robes, taxes were forgiven for 3 days, and children were encouraged to recite moral maxims aloud before breakfast. The comet stayed for a week. In desperation, the emperor ordered all mirrors in the palace turned to face the wall, apparently hoping not to reflect bad omens. He also banned fish with 2 eyes. Again, reason unknown. And still, the fear endured. Because in a system where the cosmos watched your every move, the sky wasn't decoration. It was surveillance, and comets were the loudest alarms of all. In some dynasties, comets weren't just interpreted, they were ritually punished. Yes, punished. The Han Court once held a formal scolding ceremony, where high-ranking officials faced north and read aloud a proclamation directed at the offending celestial object. It went something like, "O fiery star that sweeps across our sky, your appearance has frightened the people and cast doubt on the virtue of the ruler. Depart swiftly, lest your insolence provoke the wrath of heaven upon yourself." And then they burned incense at it. Of course the comet didn't move, but the gesture was seen as proactive, respectful, and above all, politically savvy. Because when something goes wrong, and you're the emperor, the optics of guilt matter as much as any actual policy. In fact, during the Song dynasty, one advisor suggested launching sky-facing mirrors at night to reflect purity and virtue back into the heavens. The emperor approved the plan but added a note. Ensure the mirrors are polished. Dust invites cosmic confusion. The project failed when one mirror slipped off the tower and nearly decapitated a monk. Meanwhile, among the common people, reactions to comets were a mixture of terror, superstition, and entrepreneurial opportunity. In one rural village, a man claimed he could wave away comets by spinning in circles and shouting insults at the moon. He charged 1 coin per session. People paid. The comet lingered. He raised prices. In another case, a street poet gained fame for composing comet-themed couplets that blamed corrupt officials for celestial unrest. One of his best-known lines was, "When taxes rise and justice falls, the sky erupts with blazing calls." He was arrested. His poem was memorized by schoolchildren for generations. In port cities, sailors refused to depart during comet sightings, believing that such voyages would end in shipwreck or mutiny. As a result, entire fleets were delayed. Merchants grumbled. Astrologers insisted it was safer than ignoring omens. Trade slowed. Prices rose. And still, the emperor sat at the centre of this celestial theatre, expected to remain composed and divine in the face of starlit doom. One court tale tells of an emperor who, upon hearing of a comet's arrival, invited his court musicians to compose the Song of the Blazing Star. It was meant to be uplifting. Instead, the flutist collapsed from nerves, the string players argued over tuning, and the audience wept quietly from stress. The emperor declared it a suitable mood for the heavens. In private, he ordered more incense, and possibly a new flutist. But beyond music and ritual, some emperors saw the comet as an opportunity. A celestial crisis could justify dramatic reforms, especially unpopular ones. One clever ruler, seeing a comet flare up in the western sky, declared, Heaven is clearly angry at the state of our prisons, and so he closed 3 notorious dungeons, freed 200 minor criminals, and built a park in their place. Was this because of mercy? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was because he wanted to get rid of a minister whose estate bordered those prisons. Comets gave cover for both virtue and vengeance. One particularly shrewd Empress Regent issued a decree during a comet's appearance. Heaven weeps. The time has come for the court to reflect deeply. Let all ministers submit essays on the moral character of their peers. It was brilliant. In the name of appeasing the skies, she collected blackmail material for months. Yet even in this age of calculation, fear remained real. One late Ming emperor became obsessed with comet simulations. He ordered court painters to depict every known comet in scrolls with diagrams showing tail angle, length, and emotional aura. One comet was labelled slightly remorseful, faint cinnamon smell. He studied these images nightly and claimed he could predict comet behaviour from dreams. His court humoured him. His concubines were less impressed. In his final years, he commissioned a robe embroidered entirely with silk comets. Each one bore a name. Some were historical, like Sky Broom of Xiangyang, and others were personal inventions such as Disappointment of Auntie's Tea Party. After his death, the robe was buried with him, but legend says a thread from the garment made its way into a shrine banner, and when it flapped in the wind, the stars twinkled in sympathy. Of course, not all tales ended in laughter. One emperor, paranoid and prone to fainting, was so terrified of a comet that he banned the colour white throughout the palace, claiming it invited frost from heaven. Servants were punished for wearing pale linen, dishes were broken, scrolls with white ink were burned. Ironically, it was winter. The palace grew dim. Candles were ordered in warmer hues. Snow was to be shovelled before the emperor could see it. One unfortunate painter was exiled for including clouds in a mural. Yet the comet passed, as they all did, and the emperor emerged declaring his methods effective. The records simply note, the stars departed, as did several ministers. Harmony was restored. By the Qing dynasty, comet fear had softened into ritual formalism. Astrologers still wrote detailed reports. Officials still submitted apologies. But fewer emperors panicked. One clever bureaucrat even inserted fake comet sightings into court calendars just to motivate reforms, until a real comet appeared, and everyone assumed it was a bureaucratic prank. They only believed it when the emperor's prized crane refused to dance for 3 days. By then, most of the empire had learned to live with celestial uncertainty. People married under comet skies. Poems praised their brilliance. Children pointed at them and asked if heaven had grown a tail. But deep in the forbidden city, some still remembered that once, for centuries, a streak of light could shake thrones, that kings trembled over tiny stars, that the sky, for all its beauty, never forgot to judge, and maybe, just maybe, it still does. As comet lore deepened, it began to shape imperial succession. In early dynastic China, if a comet appeared during the twilight of an emperor's reign, it was often interpreted as heaven's pressure to abdicate, and not just by the emperor himself, by the ambitious people around him. One crown prince, upon noticing a comet blazing over the eastern sky, took it as a cue to begin rehearsing speeches for his coronation. When his father refused to step down, the son began leaving pamphlets in temples suggesting that divine favour shifts like the wind. His father, the emperor, responded by commissioning astronomers to prove the comet was actually a misplaced star, and then banned wind metaphors at court. But the prince had already embroidered a dragon robe. South. At other times, comets were interpreted not as warnings to rulers, but to rivals. A jealous noble might commission an astrologer to declare, "This comet bears misfortune not for the emperor, but for one born in the hour of the snake, under the tree star, with excessive facial moles. Coincidentally, the Emperor's cousin met all three criteria. Court dynamics could shift overnight. Sudden purges, promotions, arrests, all justified by a few flickers in the sky. Heaven had become a weapon, and comets were its blade. In remote provinces, local governors developed their own comet traditions. Some built sky altars, tall platforms used exclusively to pray for favourable omens. Others carved stone comets into doorways, believing this might fool heaven into thinking one had already appeared and thus prevent the real thing. Yes, comet decoys. In one coastal region, a governor instituted the Silent Sky Month. No one was allowed to discuss celestial phenomena out loud. All sky-watching had to be done with expressions of neutrality. Smiling at a shooting star was a punishable offence. Did it help? Probably not. But the people there did become excellent at pretending nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, art began reflecting comet culture. Painters developed elaborate scrolls with comets chasing away demons or sweeping corrupt ministers from palace halls. One particularly famous painting, Mandate Broom Star, depicts a comet with a literal broom tail sweeping exasperated bureaucrats into the sea. It was wildly popular, until someone pointed out that one of the broomed figures resembled a current finance minister. The artist was promoted, then quietly reassigned to paint mountain landscapes. Even fashion got involved. During comet panics, court tailors stitched garments with celestial motifs to reassure the sky that Earth was paying attention. Robes bore constellations, comet knots, and symmetrical cloud patterns. One fashion craze involved hats shaped like stylized meteor trails. Popular among younger officials, deeply resented by elders. As one aging minister muttered, "When I was young, we respected heaven with incense and good conduct, not feathered headpieces and mood lanterns." In response, the youth wore even larger hats. Theatrical troupes, too, embraced the theme. Entire opera cycles were created around comet tales. Heroes battling star dragons, princesses reading fate in the sky, emperors weeping at heavenly shame. These performances were so emotionally charged that audiences occasionally fainted or flung rice at actors playing rogue constellations. Critics described one performance as too accurate. No one clarified what that meant. Amid all this theatricality, scholars tried to maintain dignity. They wrote treatises, measured angles, plotted paths. They tried to explain that comets followed orbits, not moral patterns. But emperors preferred omens. Omens could be interpreted, or ignored, or weaponized. Science, unfortunately, had fewer loopholes. One scholar named Li Shu nearly convinced a court that comets were just icy bodies reflecting sunlight. The emperor listened patiently, then asked whether sunlight could carry disappointment. Li Shu said no. He was sent to supervise melon production in a northern district. Melons reportedly improved, but Li Shu never saw another comet again. Meanwhile, the astrologers retained their hold. Their rooms were filled with incense charts, bird feathers, bells, and sealed boxes labelled, "Do not open until sky burns." They wore long black robes and spoke in tones that made even clear skies sound ominous. When asked how they predicted comet appearances, one replied, "When heaven shifts, I feel it in my lower spine. Also, the cranes get louder." This was considered credible. One infamous astrologer, Master Yao, once claimed that a comet would appear when the sparrows molt and the dogs howl for no reason. Weeks later, both things happened. No comet appeared. But Master Yao had already left the capital, riding west on a donkey and claiming he was chasing the stars. He later opened a tea house. His special blend was called Sky's Regret. But not everyone feared comets. Some saw them as inspiration. Poets composed verses in comet light. One wrote, "A trail of sorrow across the night. Heaven writes what hearts cannot." Calligraphers began designing scripts that mimicked comet tales. One emperor had an entire poem transcribed in this comet calligraphy, then launched the scroll on a kite so that heaven could read it directly. It crashed into a pine tree. But it's the thought that counts. Throughout the provinces, people gathered to watch comets, lighting lanterns and whispering wishes. Children asked questions, elders told stories, and somewhere, deep in the palace, a sleepless emperor counted rituals and weighed the silence of the sky. Because even if the stars weren't speaking, they were definitely watching. By the later imperial centuries, comet fear had matured into something subtler. Not hysteria, but a low constant tension that accompanied the rhythms of power. Court astrologers still submitted reports, but now they came with attached disclaimers. While the celestial body in question appears comet-like, its exact nature may reflect interstellar dust or divine metaphor. Interpretation subject to revision based on court mood and rice yield. The emperor would nod gravely. Ministers would murmur. The stars would shine, indifferent. Some rulers had begun to domesticate the fear. They scheduled comet-themed rituals in advance, kept a supply of incense ready, and ensured that no less than 3 poets were always available to compose verses in case the sky cries again. One emperor even installed a celestial emergency chamber, a small room filled with pillows, calming bamboo flutes, and portraits of previous rulers surviving comet crises. He used it frequently, and for good reason. In one infamous incident, a comet appeared the same day a provincial governor accidentally poisoned an entire festival with fermented duck paste. The emperor entered the chamber. 3 hours later he emerged wearing a robe stitched entirely with clouds and declared, "Let all duck-based feasts be preceded by sky readings." Henceforth, meteorological departments were placed in charge of poultry safety. By now, comets had evolved from omens to tools, excuses for reform, theatre, or even personal growth. One introspective emperor, upon seeing a comet, ordered a nationwide week of personal improvement. Court officials were told to list one bad habit and one virtue they wished to develop. The results were varied. The Minister of Agriculture vowed to stop muttering during meetings. The chief archivist promised to label documents with the correct year. The eunuch-in-chief simply wrote, "More naps." The emperor himself declared he would learn to listen better, and then had his astrologer demoted for interrupting a dream. Elsewhere in the far provinces, stories blossomed. A village near the northern border claimed that comets were the flicks of a celestial dragon's whiskers, each one shaking loose dreams, visions, and occasional lightning. Children there drew pictures of dragons with stars in their beards, and grandmothers tied red threads to trees to catch falling wisdom. In the mountains, monks meditated under comet light, believing it sharpened the mind. One sect even claimed that a certain comet in 1472 granted enlightenment to a goat, who then refused to eat anything but pears and was worshipped as the reincarnated master of modesty. The goat's shrine still receives pears to this day. Back at the court, comet policies grew more layered. New positions were created, such as Grand Harmonizer of Heavenly Refractions, Imperial Whisperer of Sky, Intentions, Assistant to the Deputy of Star Mood 1. Ambitious Scribe created a comet response protocol document over 300 pages long. It included colour-coded robes, white for repentance, blue for confusion, green for minor dread, acceptable flute tones, and whether mooncakes should be round or hexagonal depending on tail length. No one read it. But it received 3 calligraphy awards. Even taxes weren't immune. A finance minister once proposed the comet levy, a one-time tax to help balance the celestial harmony budget. When asked where the funds would go, he said, "To the stars, of course." He was laughed out of court, and then secretly rehired as Director of Revenue Interpretation. Meanwhile, popular culture embraced comets entirely. Board games were made such as Catch the Comet and Tail or Trail. Children played with sparkling paper kites shaped like fiery stars. Philosophers debated whether comets represented cosmic punctuation or divine handwriting. Perhaps, one scholar mused, each comet is heaven's way of saying, "Pay attention." Another replied, or maybe it's saying, "Oops." Despite this new familiarity, the old awe never quite faded. One emperor in his final years would wake in the night, gaze at the stars from his courtyard and ask the air, "Did I live gently enough that the sky might forgive me?" No comet ever answered, but he still offered tea to the sky each dawn just in case. His story ends quietly. He passed away during a clear sky, no omens, no signs. The court held a funeral with soft music, pale lanterns, and a recitation of his favourite comet poem. As the incense rose, a single white bird flew overhead. Some said it was just a bird, others believed it was a comet in disguise, arriving late. The next morning his grandson ascended the throne. Within the week a new star appeared in the sky, faint, slow, barely visible. The astrologers scrambled, reports were written, incense was lit. But the new emperor simply smiled, sipped his tea and said, "Let it shine. I'm not afraid of light." And so the tradition continued, of fear and wonder, of wisdom and superstition, of thrones under the heavens and hearts that still trembled at the stars. Because in the end, comets were never just about fire and motion. They were about questions no ruler could answer, about power that couldn't be commanded, about the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the sky was paying attention. In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh did not die. He transformed. At least that was the official story, one whispered by priests in temples, carved into golden sarcophagi, and etched into the minds of every scribe, mason, and servant who dared to glance at the royal cartouche. So when a 9-year-old boy, newly crowned, barely educated, and deeply fond of honey cakes, passed away suddenly in the 6th month of the inundation season, the empire did not mourn. Not publicly, they mobilized. Because the death of a pharaoh, especially a young one, wasn't a tragedy. It was a logistical nightmare wrapped in linen. The royal court in Memphis erupted into quiet chaos. Messengers sprinted, papyrus rustled, priests consulted calendars and omens. The embalming team, which had just returned from a nobleman's funeral in Thebes, was summoned with urgency and bribed with saffron oil to begin at once. Why the rush? Because mummification had a deadline, 70 days, no more. According to tradition, the body had to be purified, dried, anointed, wrapped, and entombed before the stars shifted and the spirit wandered. Too early, and the Ka, spirit, might be confused. Too late, and the Baa soul might get distracted by birds. This was not superstition. This was Manual number 4, Section 9, in the Book of Ritual Logistics. The embalming tent was erected near the Nile, shielded by reeds, guards, and aggressive geese. The boy's body was carefully cleaned, and his tiny organs were removed, washed with palm wine, and placed in alabaster jars guarded by god-faced lids. His heart, which should have been the centerpiece but was missing, this caused immediate panic. The chief embalmer accused the assistant embalmer, who blamed a cat, who could not be located for questioning. The crisis was averted when a priest declared that a symbolic heart of carnelian would suffice. A jeweller was woken from a nap and began carving. Meanwhile, the tomb wasn't ready. A proper pharaoh's tomb took years, decades ideally. This one had to be done in weeks. Stonecutters were rushed to a forgotten side chamber in the Valley of the Kings, previously used for storing spare sarcophagi and goat feed. Blueprints were drawn, then redrawn. One wall collapsed. Another revealed a painted mural of a dancing hippo, which no one could explain. They covered it with plaster. Back at the palace, the mourning rituals were staged. A court poet composed an epic of sorrow, which included a scene where the Nile itself wept and crocodiles sobbed respectfully. A musician was commissioned to write a dirge using flutes tuned to minor sorrow mode. No one liked it, but it was ceremonial. The Queen Mother, still wearing her daily eyeliner, was instructed to weep exactly twice per public appearance. Any more would signal instability, any less would suggest indifference. She practiced in a mirror. Then came the matter of the procession. Tradition required that the pharaoh's body be paraded through the streets, carried on a golden bier, flanked by sacred cows and dancers painted blue. Problem: the sacred cows were in the delta, the dancers were on strike, and the golden bier had been repurposed to serve pastries at the last festival. Solutions: cows were substituted with exceptionally clean goats. The dancers were bribed with honey dates. The bier was cleaned, scrubbed, and hastily regilded. The boy's body, now fully mummified and fragrant with frankincense and lotus, was wrapped in linen inscribed with prayers, charms, and an oddly placed multiplication table, added by a scribe who misunderstood the instructions. The funeral itself was a spectacle. Priests chanted, musicians played, a falcon was released and immediately flew into a pillar. Incense filled the air. The procession wound through Memphis, through crowded streets, past stunned merchants and grumbling bakers, until it reached the sacred bark on the Nile. There, the pharaoh's sarcophagus was loaded aboard a boat shaped like a papyrus stalk. It sailed downstream, followed by dozens of smaller boats, some filled with mourners, others filled with officials quietly discussing succession options. And there were many, because a 9-year-old pharaoh rarely leaves a clear air, especially one who died without issuing a decree beyond more honey, please. In the court, factions began forming. One noble claimed the boy had whispered his name before dying. Another insisted the gods had spoken through a clay figurine during lunch. The high priest of Amun suggested that perhaps the gods should choose the next ruler through a sacred lottery. He had already printed his own name on 3 of the tablets. Meanwhile, in the tomb, workers toiled. Walls were painted with hasty hieroglyphs. Offerings were arranged. Jars of beer, baskets of figs, a model chariot, 2 jars labelled, "Definitely not honey." Statues of gods were placed with care, though one had the wrong head and had to be swapped last minute. The burial mask, meant to be pure gold, was actually gilded wood, painted hurriedly by a palace artist who also handled seasonal murals. It depicted a serene child's face with slightly crossed eyes and a faint smile. Some said it looked too peaceful. Others said it looked hungry. Either way, it was sealed inside. As the 70th day approached, the tomb was closed with ceremony. The door was plastered, the prayers recited, the guards posted. The boy king, now safely transitioned into the afterlife, would begin his journey across the stars, or so it was hoped, because in Memphis the real work was only beginning. Back in the palace, the aftermath of the young pharaoh's death had taken a sharp turn, not toward grief, but toward bureaucratic turbulence. With the boy buried and the tomb sealed, the priests of various temples began submitting claims for divine reimbursement. The Temple of Horus demanded 40 jars of barley for spiritual alignment. The Temple of Bastet requested compensation for emotional feline labour. The Temple of Thoth, never one to be left behind, submitted a 6-page scroll outlining cosmic accounting irregularities caused by the sudden death of a ruler during Mercury retrograde. It was stamped with no fewer than 12 ibis-shaped seals. The treasurer tried to refuse the claims. He was immediately accused of sacrilege and spent the night being pelted with papyrus invoices under a statue of Anubis. Meanwhile, the Queen Mother was attempting to keep the throne warm, politically speaking. She began holding public ceremonies, feeding birds, releasing symbolic lotus blossoms, listening to flute solos, all while wearing more gold than a hippo shrine. It was subtle, but it was clear. She had no intention of stepping aside without influencing the next ruler. Whispers filled the air. One theory claimed she wanted to appoint a cousin's son, aged 12, prone to hiccups, but excellent with obelisks. Another rumour insisted she was grooming her own astrologer as a puppet ruler. He denied it, but wore a new headdress the next day. The high priest of Amun, not to be outmanoeuvred, hosted his own public ritual in which a sacred ibis walked across a painted scroll map and pecked repeatedly at the city of Thebes. "The gods have spoken," he declared. "Leadership must return to the south." A day later, a counter-prophecy emerged. A goose in the palace garden waddled toward the northern wall, honked twice, and defecated near a cartouche of the late pharaoh. A junior priest interpreted this as a sign of dynastic continuity. His interpretation was copied, distributed, and mysteriously quoted by no fewer than 3 royal advisers by noon. While adults schemed, the children of the palace were inventing their own funeral games. They built miniature tombs out of date boxes, wrapped dolls in linen, and held competitive sarcophagus races in the hallways. One child, dressed as Osiris, declared that he would judge the souls of everyone who didn't share their honey cakes. He was given extra cakes. In the scribe quarters, things were no better. Every document now required updated titles. The living Horus had to be struck through, corrected, and replaced with the reborn star. Whole libraries were in revision. Copyists developed wrist cramps. Ink supplies ran low. One scribe had a nervous breakdown and began labelling cats as temporary gods. It was, as one official noted, a time of both mourning and minor administrative hysteria. But not all was chaos. In a small chamber behind the main temple, a council of dream interpreters was convened. These men and women, trained in reading symbolic visions, were tasked with identifying divine signs that would point to the rightful heir. They listened to dreams from everyone: soldiers, cooks, grain measurers. Some highlights included a baker who dreamed of a cobra with sandals, which was taken to mean watch your step; a priest who saw the moon turn into a fish, suggesting flexible leadership; a servant who saw herself eating lotus soup with a lion, generally interpreted as hunger, but one dream stood out. A young stable boy reported dreaming that the deceased pharaoh appeared before him holding a reed pen and drawing a star on the stable wall. This dreamer made it all the way to the Queen Mother, who ordered the wall inspected. No star was found. But a stable hand confessed to having drawn something similar, because he was bored. Regardless, it was interpreted as a sign of celestial guidance. The stable boy was promoted to junior scroll polisher. Elsewhere, a group of nobles began investigating alternative burial models. The 70-day window had been met, yes, but what if extra rituals were needed? An architect proposed an annex to the tomb for spiritual overflow. A priest suggested a second burial, just in case the first one was too humid. A merchant tried to sell a divine ventilation system. Nothing was approved, but everyone agreed that the late boy pharaoh might be the first ruler to rise again simply out of boredom. Meanwhile, local gossip began attaching miraculous qualities to the funeral. Vendors swore that incense smoke had taken the shape of a falcon. A brewer claimed his beer had turned slightly sweeter during the procession. A donkey owner insisted his animal bowed 3 times while passing the tomb, though others said it had just stumbled. A new cult of the child king began to take root. They called him "He who left early to watch the stars." Shrines appeared, often near bakeries. Offerings included tiny sandals, milk, toys, and poems written in childish scrawl. One poet penned, "He played among gods, then went to sleep in gold, the sky now holds his laughter." The poem was copied hundreds of times, and the boy king, who had once hidden under tables to avoid lessons, was now depicted with glowing eyes, star-touched hands, and the ability to bless crops with a sneeze. This elevation worried the court, not because of religion, but because popular affection was a dangerous thing. If the people loved a dead king too much, they might resist the next one. Worse, they might invent signs demanding his return. So a campaign of gentle forgetting was launched. Royal artists were instructed to update murals with more mature figures. Bards were paid to sing of other heroes. Public announcements praised the cycle of life and transition without naming names. Even the tomb was gradually de-emphasized. Guards were reduced. Tours restricted. Eventually the location was declared temporarily flooded, despite no record of water nearby. But it was too late. The memory of the boy had already entered myth. And in the silence of the tomb, under the dry stone and faded pigments, something remained. Not the boy himself, not really, but the echo of a life too short, a crown too heavy, and a funeral that had become a fable. Several weeks after the funeral, as the scent of frankincense began to fade from the palace walls, and the mourning garments were replaced with fresh linens and politics, Egypt settled into its next phase, official uncertainty. The boy pharaoh was gone, his tomb sealed, his name whispered now only in poetry and nervous council meetings, but the throne still very much vacant. The royal court had, of course, appointed a regent, a senior noble known primarily for his ability to fall asleep during harp recitals. His role was temporary, his power less so. He began issuing decrees in the name of transitional harmony, most of which benefited his cousins. The Queen Mother, unamused, escalated her public appearances. She now wept near shrines, donated to orphanages, and hosted philosophical salons featuring children reciting proverbs like, "A fish that lies still is eaten last." The people applauded. The regent scowled. But outside the walls of Memphis, in dusty villages and busy ports, the people of Egypt were less concerned with dynastic maneuvering and more with the rising legend of the boy king. Merchants began selling amulets shaped like his burial mask. Street performers dressed as the Young One of Gold told fictional tales of his adventures in the underworld. One featured a cobra chess match with Osiris, another involved a chariot race on the backs of sacred crocodiles. Children named their kittens after him. Farmers whispered his name before planting. It was myth-making in real time, and it could not be stopped. The priests knew this, so they tried to redirect it. They announced that the boy pharaoh had been reborn as a star, a very specific one, faintly visible just before dawn. They created a ritual of dawn greetings, where the faithful would face the eastern sky and raise their arms. Postcards with star charts were distributed. One included a poem that read, "He rises before Ra, in linen of light, child of heaven, watcher of night." It worked, mostly, except some villagers claimed to see 2 stars and began arguing over which one was the true pharaoh. One group split off and founded a new sect called the Twice-Born, who believed the boy's soul had duplicated out of joy. No one could refute it. The movement gained followers. Back in the administrative quarters, scrolls piled higher. Every report now required annotations on posthumous influence. One accountant insisted that grain yields had improved since the boy's funeral and requested a holiday in his name. A bureaucrat denied it. He was then demoted to inspector of ceremonial sandals. Meanwhile, a young sculptor had carved a statue of the boy holding a lotus and a scroll. It was delicate, elegant, and subtly sad. The Queen Mother saw it and wept, not out of mourning, but recognition. "He looks ready to speak," she said, "but knows we wouldn't listen." The statue was placed in the palace courtyard. Within days, pilgrims began leaving offerings. Not gold or jewels, but toys, feathers, poems, and tiny cakes. The regent ordered it removed. The guards refused. So instead, the statue was given a title, The Listener. Stories spread that on quiet nights, if you whispered your worries to him, they would vanish by morning. Children especially believed this. Guards reported finding notes tucked in the statue's hands, mostly about school, parents, or missing pets. One simply read, "I'm scared of growing up." Another said, "Please let my brother be nice tomorrow." In response, a poet composed a hymn. "O Pharaoh of silence, O child of still breath, hear the small sorrows we carry beneath." The hymn was sung during a festival. People cried. The regent requested it be replaced with something less tearful. He was ignored. Then came the dreams. It began with a fisherman near Thebes, who swore the boy appeared to him, laughing and riding a wave. Then a baker dreamed of the child sitting in her kitchen, asking for the flattest bread you have. Soon, dozens of such visions appeared. The palace formed a dream committee. Members were appointed based on previous nap quality and reputation for seriousness. They met twice a week, sipped herbal tea, and analysed dreams using a ranking scale from possibly indigestion to divine communication. Most dreams scored low to moderate mystical relevance, until one servant reported seeing the boy walking through the tomb, gently correcting the placement of a figurine. The next day, that exact figurine was found turned sideways in the tomb. The discovery set off a frenzy. Was the tomb active? Was the boy speaking? Some wanted to reopen it. Others screamed blasphemy. Eventually, the tomb's entrance was given a new plaque. "Here sleeps the Pharaoh of Peace. Do not disturb unless invited." The statue of the listener was relocated to a new temple built in the western fields. Not grand, but clean, painted in pale blues and lined with papyrus reeds. Every week people came with gifts and songs. Some prayed, others just sat quietly. One morning, A girl arrived with a jar of water and a broken toy hippo. She left them at the statue's feet and whispered, "It's okay if you're bored." "I get bored too." Then she smiled, bowed, and skipped away. The priest watching the moment later recorded it as a miracle of shared emotion. By the final month of that strange and sacred year, the myth of the boy pharaoh had grown so thick that it was hard to breathe without inhaling some version of his story. He had become everything. A star, a whisper, a protector of dreams, a source of luck, a guardian of cats. One rumour even claimed his ghost helped a merchant win a barley dispute. In short, the child who once feared ceremonial headdresses was now a cultural phenomenon. Yet the royal court remained restless. The regent's power was slipping. His decrees were now questioned, his ceremonies half attended, and worst of all, his astrologer had predicted a period of mild irrelevance. The palace staff had begun calling him the placeholder, not to his face, of course. Meanwhile, the Queen Mother had disappeared from public life. Some said she'd retired to a shrine to meditate. Others claimed she was writing a book of wisdom scrolls. One theory involved her riding a sacred ostrich across the desert in search of truth. All of them were probably false. What was true was this: the people didn't miss the government. They missed the boy. And that, said the high priest of Amun, was dangerous, because longing becomes ritual, and ritual becomes power. So a new plan was devised to formally close the chapter, not with silence, but with spectacle. A festival of farewell was announced. It would not be a mourning, they said, but a celebration, a final salute to the child of the horizon. Preparations began immediately. A massive golden bark was constructed, not to sail but to stand in the temple courtyard. Inside, a sculpture of the boy was placed, surrounded by painted stars, toys, scrolls, and offerings from across the land. Artisans painted scenes of his celestial journey, a stylized version of what everyone now believed, that the boy had been reborn into the sky, dancing among the stars, sharing jokes with Ra, outwitting Set in riddles. The bark was surrounded with musicians, dancers, and scribes. Children were invited to sing. Old women recited lullabies. Even cats were brought in, one of which reportedly purred at the base of the statue for an hour straight. On the final night, the bark was illuminated with oil lamps. A choir sang. The air smelled of cinnamon and sweet myrrh. Then, one by one, people came forward and whispered their thanks. Some left tokens: a ribbon, a stone, a dried fig, a poem. One man left a single sandal and said, "He helped me walk straight." When the sun rose, the bark remained, but no one approached. It had become a symbol, a sacred marker of closure. Except it didn't feel like closure. Because in the days that followed, new stories began to surface. A fisherwoman claimed that a shadow in the water had whispered advice. A child insisted the boy king had appeared in his dream to teach him how to tie sandals. A gardener discovered a flower growing in the shape of a cartouche. No one dared to call them lies. Even the most sceptical officials stopped issuing denials. They just nodded slowly and wrote things down. It was clear now, the myth would not end. So rather than suppress it, the court decided to contain it. A new temple of the eternal youth was planned, not as a monument, but as a place of storytelling. Priests would collect dreams, scribes would write songs, visitors could leave tokens, and every full moon a poem would be recited in honour of the boy king. Not to worship him, but to remember. Construction began in silence. But before the first stone was placed, something peculiar happened. A group of children, uninvited, unsupervised, showed up with small clay bricks, feathers, coloured beads and drawings. They began building their own temple in the sand nearby. It had no walls, no roof, just a circle and a little mound. They named it the place where you can laugh. A priest approached and asked what they were doing. A girl replied, "He was a kid. He should have a kid place." And just like that, the future of the myth was sealed. Because what began as grief became a legend. What became a legend became a ritual. And what became a ritual became childhood. Years later, visitors to the great temple would still see the original statue, the listener, standing quietly in a garden of reeds. But beyond the formal site, in every village and dusty corner of the land, children still made little temples out of sand, told stories of a golden boy who outwitted the gods, and whispered secrets to the stars. No one commanded them to, they just did. Because for them he was never just a pharaoh, he was the kid who listened, and he never really left.